It is the 28th of July 1914. Emerging from the battlefields of the Balkans, the clouds of war are hovering over Europe. As the continent plunges itself into a catastrophic war, Japan views the events with a keen interest. As this war is approaching its first month, Japan is faced with one question: should it enter the Great War? To understand whether Japan would join the war, it would be essential to understand the country's history in the modern era. For about 200 years, Japan was under a feudalistic military dictatorship that imposed a near total isolation on the country. However, by the mid 19th century, the military dictatorship was overthrown and the emperor began to play a far more active role in Japanese politics. The new imperial government then launched a program to rapidly modernize Japan. In addition to technological advancements, the country also saw significant social change, with the centuries old decentralized feudal state being abolished in favor of a centralized nation state. By the turn of a new century, Japan restructured itself into a modern nation state modeled after the great powers of Europe. Tokyo also began to pursue an aggressive foreign policy, starting with the annexation of the Ryukyu Islands in 1879, annexation of Taiwan in 1894, and the annexation of Korea in 1910. It also replaced China as the main Asian power and gave the Russian Empire a humiliating defeat in 1905. On the eve of the Great War, Japan was an emerging empire, controlling land from Sakhalin in the north to Taiwan in the south. Japan had long been closely aligned with the British, forming a military alliance with them in 1902. As an belligerent power, the British requested the Japanese to target German shipping in Chinese waters or to provide other forms of naval support. But the government in Tokyo viewed the war in Europe as an opportunity to avenge Germany for previously restricting its attempts to expand into China. This war also provided a chance to expand their influence in China. This then led to Japan declaring war on Germany on the 23rd of August 1914. In the war with Germany, the main objective of Japan was to capture Qingdao, a strategic German-controlled city on the Chinese coast. After a 2-month-long siege, the city finally fell to Japanese soldiers in November 1914. The fall of Qingdao meant the end of any real German presence in Asia, leading to the capture of German possessions in the Pacific. However, Japan's objectives in China were not yet fulfilled. As the great powers were preoccupied with the war in Europe, the government in Tokyo considered that it was the right time to expand their influence in China. After the 1911 revolution, political upheaval in the country led to the formation of a military dictatorship. Then in January 1915, Japan sent a list of demands to the government in Beijing, which were called the 21 demands. These demands would have effectively made China into a Japanese protectorate. This caused protests in China against the demands, and after facing pressure from the British and the Americans, Japan dropped the harsher demands. China then acceded to the revised list of demands. Outside of Asia, Japan didn't play a significant role in the war, although politicians in Tokyo were not supportive of sending troops to Europe. A naval squadron was sent to the Mediterranean in 1917. Domestically, Japan experienced an economic boom as its European competitors withdrew from Asian markets due to the war. This further propelled the industrialization and modernization of Japan. An example of this was the modernization of the Japanese tax system during the war. This war also led to an increase in inflation, which subsequently caused rice riots in 1918. However, this economic boom brought by the war also came to an end soon after the war. It was the 11th of November 1918. By then, the Central Powers were defeated. Bulgaria was forced to sue for peace. Even the mighty Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires were on their knees. Then Germany, the only nation standing against the Allies, signed an armistice, bringing an end to this war. With the war coming to an end, the Allied powers sought to reshape the world. One of the ways attempted was to build a new world order through the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 to 1920. The main objectives of the Japanese delegation at the conference were to secure their hold over German possessions in the Pacific and Asia, and to be accepted as an equal to the great Western powers. Therefore, they were not interested in playing a role in European affairs. In this conference, they were granted a mandate over the German possessions in the Pacific. German possessions in China, primarily on the Shandong Peninsula, were also handed over to Japan, infuriating the Chinese delegation at the conference. This dispute was later resolved by a treaty in 1922, which returned the former German possessions on the Shandong Peninsula back to China. Japan's third main objective was to be accepted as a power equal to the West. Although Japan did become one of the four main members of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, they felt that the great powers of Europe didn't consider them as their equal. This became clear when a Japanese proposal, which would have ensured racial equality between the members of the League of Nations, wasn't endorsed by the United States and the British Empire. During the conference, one major Allied power which wasn't present was Russia. While the major powers were imposing treaties on the defeated powers, Russia was going through a period of upheaval. After a Bolshevik revolution in 1917, a civil war broke out between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-Bolshevik Whites. Fearing that a Bolshevik victory would further embolden communist movements in other countries, a coalition of more than 10 countries, including British dominions, intervened in the civil war in favor of the Whites. Japan also joined this coalition, launching an invasion into Siberia. Japan was historically in opposition to Russia due to conflicting interests in Korea and Manchuria. Therefore, it viewed the war to be as golden opportunity to establish a buffer state in Siberia, securing the home islands from a Russian invasion in the future. Japan then sent around 70,000 troops to Siberia, occupying the eastern portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. As the tide of the war turned against the Whites, most of the foreign powers began to withdraw from their troops from Russia. Japan then retreated and occupied an area which would constitute the modern Primorsky Krai of Russia, along with occupying northern Sakhalin. However, in 1922, Tokyo unilaterally withdrew from mainland Russia, with the army withdrawing from northern Sakhalin in 1925. This shattered Japan's dream of establishing a buffer state in Siberia. The Great War was a transformative event in the modern history of Japan. It brought down the Russian and German empires to their knees, allowing Tokyo to expand its influence into the Pacific. Rising to the position of being the main Asian power, Japan was now considered to be a great power on the world stage. However, post war European rejection of the notion of racial equality also was a factor in driving Japan towards militant ultranationalism in the future. This then became the stepping stone for the Second World War in Asia.